Hi. So today I thought it might be fun for us to take a look at a more advanced way of coding in PineScript. And that's to create something that's very common that technical analysis uses all the time called trend lines. Just keep in mind that the purpose of this tutorial is not to show you the one and only way of defining trend lines, but just a way that might work for you. I'm more interested in showing you different ways of how to think about PineScript and some of the different features that are there that you might not be aware of. So let's take a look. All right, so as usual, let's go ahead and start a Pine script. We'll call this, and since we know we're going to be using a lot of lines here, actually, let's put them all. Let's put the maximum of 500 labels, 500 lines, 500 boxes. Because I think we're at least going to be using those. We're not going to use boxes. In our settings, we know we're definitely going to want to define our pivot lengths. So let's call it pivot left bars, right bars. And we are going to want to discover our pivots. So we're going to use, we're definitely going to need pivot high. We're going to pass the left and right bar count. We're going to need pivot low. All right, and then we're going to need a way of storing those pivots for when we're ready. So let's go ahead and create, and I'm ready for pivots. Now I'm storing these, and these will be chart points. Now I'm storing these pivots because if we only deal with pivots that are live at the chart at the time we're making the calculation, we're not going to be able to go back and forth and make changes over time, like analyze pivots that existed previously, which we're going to want to do. So yes, there's going to be repainting inside of the script, but it's necessary, or I find it's necessary, in order to do things that require pivots that existed far in the past, or that sort of thing. So we'll see. All right, so let's just start off marking our pivots on the chart. So if we have a pivot, we're going to say if there's not NA. So here, pivot high and pivot low will return a NA if it doesn't actually have any value. And then if it does find a pivot high or a pivot low, it will return the value of the high and low respectively. And so we know that if that variable is not an A, that a pivot has been found, or at least a pivot has been found this many bars ago. If we just pass the, we could just pass pivot high here, but if we do that, we're going to get an error. We're going to get an error here that says the condition parameter of if accepts a bool argument. To avoid potential unexpected results, pass a bool value or expression to this parameter. So even though the value, the float value here will resolve as true, we want to avoid this error and have we want to follow guidelines by passing this instead. So if that, in this case, if pivot high ends up being a pivot, we want to store that pivot within our pivot array. So inside our pivot array, in this case, a PVH, we want to go ahead and I'm going to unshift this because I like since the pivots are going to show up in the chart from left to right, when I'm actually considering it, when I'm actually reading it, I read it from right to left. And so I like to unshift my pivots into the array. And I want to put my pivot in here. And we set it up here as a chart point. And a chart point has, it's a variable type within PineScript that comes with index, time, and price fields to it. And so we can create that over here. So we can say that the current pivot is equal to chart point. We can do now, so this would normally be the one that that'll give the value of the bar that we're on. So now we can pass it the price, and then it'll have automatically the bar index and the time of now, as well as the price that we pass to it. But we don't want that, right? We want it from 5 bars ago, because a pivot is only true in this case when 5 bars before the high and 5 bars after the high, that the value we're looking at is the highest of that. And so So in a sense, we're looking for something like this. So even though this is the pivot high, we'll only find out the pivot is like over here on the 5th bar. And so we want to go back and grab the high from that pivot. So if we do that, we don't want to use, now we want to use new. So if we use new, then we can pass it the time, index, and price. So we're going to pass it the time from 5 bars ago, the bar index from 5 bars ago, and then the high from 5 bars ago. Right, and that's what we'll pass here. And since we already have a variable for this, we're going to use, since we needed 5 bars ago, because of this pivot right bars, we're going to replace the 5 in here with that. And that way, if we update the setting within the script, it'll find the appropriate one. It'll pass here, and it'll add that to the array. We also want to do a little cleanup over here. This array, as it's finding pivots across the chart, there could be up to, I think, like 10,000 bars in the chart. We don't want to be in a situation where we're getting, where this array is just filled with tens of thousands of values, because once we loop through this array in order to figure out certain trend lines, it'll be very cumbersome. So let's go ahead and limit that. We'll limit that to, let's call it 100 for now. So we can say that if this pivot high, if the size is more than 100, then we want to remove. Here, since I want to remove, since the items are being added in with unshift, which means that every new item is at the beginning of the array, the beginning of the array we want to keep, and we want to get the item that's at the last, at the end of the array. So we want to get pivot high, and we want to grab the size, and we're gonna, so that whole size represents the last one, and then we have to do -1 since this is, the array is indexed to 0. And so the last item in the array is has an index of the size of the array -1. So in this way, we'll go ahead and remove the last item. So now this array, addPivot, will always contain all the pivots that we're expecting. And we can see that just by, if we go ahead and add those pivots as a label, let's just add a label on the chart. Actually, we can just do it this way. If we loop through all the pivots and draw a label on the chart at the bar time, we want to use, so now the variable that we're going to have here, we're doing a for loop. And so here I'm saying that PV is going to equal to my pivot, my chart point that's inside that array. That chart point, as we saw before, has 3 fields: the time, the index, and the price. But since it's adding these in throughout the chart, my I can't place it using, I can't place the label using index, because I can't go more than 500 bars back in the time, but I can use time. So if you use time over here, and then the value, let's say we do, now if we do this, every single time that the that the bars update on the chart, we're going to get additional labels every time. So let's just go ahead and delete all the labels that are there to begin with. So we're going to loop through all the labels, because there's a variable called label all that represents all the labels that are on the chart, and we're just going to delete them. We're going to delete them before we run the script. Okay, so let's just save this, add that to the chart, and we should see 100 labels that are showing the most recent pivots. Let's make that a little bit smaller. And triangles are a little aggressive. Let's do circles. So over here, every point that is the highest amongst 5, it'll show a pivot. So the highest value amongst 5, pivot, and so on. Great. So we don't need that there. Just trying to show you guys that those pivots are in the array. All right, let's move on a little bit more. So we did that for the pivot high, so let's go ahead and add it for the pivot low. Now you're seeing that we're repeating this code. So since we're repeating code, what do we do? Well, we turn that into a function. So we can turn this into a function. Let's say, let's go with add pivot. And I'm going to pass this the float value of pivot. So it'll be these variables, pvh and pvl, that are going to be passed to it. So whatever pivot it is. And then I need to know if I'm dealing with the pivot high or pivot low. So I'm going to pass a bool variable here that we'll see in use in a second. And then this is what will happen afterwards. Now, one of the benefits of using a global variable here to store our pivots is that global arrays are available to your functions. So if you had a global variable like this or something like that, and you wanted to modify that variable within the script, it would say within the function, it would say you can't do that. But an array you can, since the idea of the array is created, is not modified when you modify the contents of the array. So over here, we need to set up a for this guy over here when we're calling this function. We can go ahead and say, let's say for example, add pivot. You can pass pvh because that'll be the float. And then this is going to be a high. So we're going to say, yes, it's the high. And I need to update the relevant array to add the pivots into. So in here, I can call a variable, and I could say that if this h boolean is a high, then I want to use a pvh, and otherwise I'm going to use a pvl. This is called a ternary operator. This is the same thing as saying if h apv else apv apvl. Same thing as that. And it's the same thing if you wanted to do a switch case where you have apv is equal to switch. And you had something like this. These are all the same thing. But a ternary operator is much cleaner. It happens all in one line. So now we can replace this apvh with apv because it'll always represent the relevant array. And if we actually turn this into a method, we can pass this value at the beginning, so we can chain it. This is just my preferred way. You can do it either way. This is just the way I like it. So let's go ahead and add the L. This needs to be changed to false. And now this array is set up. These two global arrays are set up with the correct pivot highs and pivot lows. Oh, we're missing one thing over here. Here, the source. We're not going to want this to be high, right? We need this to be a low when we're dealing with the pivot low. And so we can do a ternary operator over there if we wanted to. Where we do this. So it's high, we do that. And it's not, we do that. Perfect. This is reducing the size, and we have one function that handles the adding of the pivots. So now that we have our pivots inside of our arrays, we want to be able to analyze them in order to figure out if there's any trend there. So what we're looking for is we're going to be drawn theoretically a line from every pivot high to the other pivot high, and every pivot low to another pivot low. But what we want to avoid is if the price ever breaks above the pivot high or breaks below the pivot low, well, we don't want that line anymore. We want to cancel that out. So we're going to call each one of these lines a trend. That's how we'll see it. So let's see how we can set that up. All right. So after every time we've added a new pivot, we're going to want to go ahead and loop through all the different. We're going to want to loop through all the pivots to check how this pivot relates to the previous ones. So we're going to say we're going to loop through the previous pivots. So this is like the for loop we saw before. So we know that APV right now will be whichever one, pivot high or pivot low, whichever one we're in, and we're going to loop through each one. And when we're looping through each one in this array, the first value here will be the index, so it's positioned within the array, and the second one will be, we're going to call it previous, which represents the previous pivot point. Because remember, the pivot point that we just added to the array is the current one right now, and so anything that's before that, any pivot before that, I'm considering that to be previous, the first point in the trend, and the current point is the last point in the trend. So I'm calling that previous. And what I'm going to want to do is decide if I'm going ahead and adding this this trend, because as it checks every single pivot with all the other pivots, we can also at the same time check if it's ever been broken, right? So even though I'm taking a pivot that might have happened a month ago, if the price has ever broken that level, well, I don't want it, right? Because I don't want any broken trends. So I have to decide if I'm going to be drawing this on the chart or not. So let me just go ahead and assume that every one of these trends are valid, and only if it's not valid will I ignore it. So I'm going to go here. I'm going to say, actually, I have to make one more check. I have to make sure that I'm checking that the previous, because we just added the pivot into this array. That means at some point in this looping, as we're checking all the different pivots, it'll check itself. And so we only want to deal with a previous pivot if it's actually previous to our current time. So we're going to say if the previous time is less than current time, right? Current represents the pivot we just added to this array. That's the only time we want to check anything. So if it is, we want to go ahead and check. All right, so what am I doing here? We're looping through, we already have our pivot right now. We're looping through all the pivots, and we're considering the first pivot to be all the previous points, the first point of the trend. Then I'm looping again, right? Because now the second point, this other point, I'm looking through all the other pivots to see if the pivots ever broke the trend, and if any pivots ever broke the trend, well then I don't want to add this one to our. I don't want to consider this trend. So this third one, which we're calling a check, is this is what's checking. You can call it whatever you like. Now, I need a function that will allow me to determine if this point, this checkpoint, is indeed above the pivot high trend or below the pivot low trend. So I'm going to write a function. I'm going to call it position trend, and I'm going to pass it the previous, current, and check chart points. All right, so let's go ahead and write that function. So I'm passing it chart point. I don't have to declare what kind of, if I'm not using a method, I don't have to say what kind of variable it is, but it is a good habit to know what this is, because when you're either coming back into your script in the future or somebody else is looking into it, it's really nice for them to know what you expect it to pass here. There are certain circumstances, like when you're using request security, like when you're trying to get information from a different time frame or doing some sort of, some types of computation, that it's useful not to have this there, but that's not usually the case. So here what we want to do is we're going to be calculating the vectors for between x, basically the first chart point and the second chart point. I'm calling this xy1, xy2, because it has the x and y variables for the first point and the x and y variables for the second point, and then obviously x and y variables for the third point. And what I want to do is I want to find out what the difference is between here xy2 index minus x1 difference between the prices. Let me sure I'm writing it right. Yes, 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 yes. Then I want to check the X3 index minus x1 index, and then dy2. I'm checking xy3 price. All right, so why was I using time before when I was drawing the labels on the chart, and why am I using index now? The reason for that is that time, when I was using time, I was trying to pinpoint specifically the point where I wanted these labels to appear on the chart. But when we're dealing with charts, the thing that's consistent, that the interval that's consistent is the time, which is to say the number of bars, because you can have the say price before the time when you're using the time, you can be spanning that trend, could be spanning a weekend, a holiday, what have you, and so the time variable becomes inconsistent. So what might look like 10 bars on a chart might actually in fact have been 15 bars if it was actually calculating a bar for every in this case every 15 minutes that the market wasn't open or there wasn't any data. And so when you're doing any calculation that has to do with with regular intervals and the scale of the chart, you have to use index in order to do the calculation, which is why it's useful to have index and time within the chart point object. Then we want to calculate the cross product, and it will be dx1 times dy2 minus dy1 times dx2, right? No need to look, you can always use ChatGPT if you wanted to in order to figure out how to do these things. You just need to understand like what it is that we're trying to do. We're trying to calculate if this third point, its relationship to the trend line. And so this cross product, what will happen is that if this cross product is over 0, then we know we'll return 1 because we'll know that it is above the line. If it's not, so here, if the cross product, actually let's do it this way. If the cross product is above 0, return 1. If it's below 0, we'll return -1, and otherwise 0. So we're using a switch case in order to do this neatly. Perfect. So now we can use this function over here, and then we know if this is equal to 1, then we know it's above the line, right? And if it's above the line for a pivot high trend, we want to go ahead and stop this from drawing. We don't want this to be considered a trend. And in fact, we have to modify this to use H, because if it's -1 for on pivot low, we want it to do the same thing too. Now, if it turns out it goes through that loop, it goes through this loop, and it actually says, okay, we can go ahead, draw is still true, we want to go ahead and deal with the trend. So now we're going to say here, trend, and we're going to say if the trend, we're going to add a new user-defined type. So what's going to happen here is that I need a trend object. I need something like chart point or what have you for the trend. Now my trend is representing an XY1 point and XY2 point. I normally could use a line. I could use a line object in order to draw this. But if I wanted to add one, the line is drawn immediately, and I'm not going to want to draw the line immediately. As I said at the beginning, we're going to want to be able to add or remove things, and I don't want to have to deal with any line management. Plus, if I wanted to add any extra information associated with this trend, any extra details associated with this trend, I can do that with a line. I can add extra fields to the line. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new user-defined type, our own custom type, so that I can go ahead and treat this, and I can have the fields that I'm interested in. So let's go ahead here, and we're creating a new type, and that type we'll call trend. And this trend will take as an XY. Since we already have the XY1, we'll pass that to it. Since we'll also have the XY2. And we're going to need other things for this as well. For the moment, let's leave it on this. And later on, we can always add more fields to it if you need to. So here we have our trend. And I'm going to pass in previous and current, right? So that is the here the xy1 and xy2. So that's going to be available to me in that trend. So later on, when I want to draw this trend line, I could just loop through an array which I'm going to add this trend to, and then have those variables for me, have those coordinates. All right, so after that's set up, I want to go ahead and add this trend to an array so that I have it available for me. We're going to separate those trends as trend highs and trend lows, just because it'll be easier for us in case we ever needed to have a way of distinguishing them. We'll already have it distinguished right at the get-go. And so let's go ahead and create, so it'll be like we did before. A variable, we're using var because we want this array never to change. We want it to be set at the beginning, and then we're adding to it. And we're going to call this, let's go with trend high, and it'll be array. And instead of passing chart point as the type, we're going to pass trend, the user type that we just created. And then this we can modify within here, just like we did at the beginning with the pivots. So here we'll say a trend, if it's H, we want it to be high, and otherwise we want it to be low. These are just my naming schemes. I like I have my own way of naming my variables so that I know where I am. When I'm removing letters from words, it's just to help it so that if I were to double click and like Command D to find all the occurrences of this, I know I'm going to find the word TRND that represents this type of variable, as opposed to the word trend, which will show up again and again in the script. Just my way I've gone about it. Other prefix it with a variable. Some other people do it in different ways. So I'm going to go ahead here, and then I'm going to add this trend to, now that I have that, I'm going to add this trend to the array. I'm going to push that in, and I'm going to push this in using push as opposed to unshift, because the trend, I'm expecting that the newest trends that go in are at the end of the array. So I'm going to add trend, boom. And I'll do the same thing that we did over here. We want this to stay at a relatively small size. And there we go. And since we're using push, the first value is what we want to remove. Okay. So why I do that? And since now this function is dealing with trends, I'm going to call this trend instead of pivot. All right, so why do I add these things into an array the way I am is because I like to only draw my drawings in certain circumstances, especially when I'm dealing with repainting and I'm reorganizing things on the chart. I like to only do it at the end. I like to do it once at the end. So when I'm on the last bar, that's when I'm going to go ahead and loop through different trends. So I'm going to loop through here. So for each trend, and let's say trend H, what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw it. So let's say I'm going to just draw it simply. We'll do what we ultimately want is a line that goes from TRN. If I do dot notation, I want the first point to be this chart point. So line you can use a first point, which is a chart point, second, another chart point. Then I need my X location. I want to use bar time because since we're going to have trends that are more than 500 bars back, we need to do that. I want this to extend. No, I don't want this to extend for the moment. Let's do the color. I want it to be the foreground color. So just if we're on a dark background, it will be a light color. If we're on a light background, it'll be a dark color. I want the style to be dashed, and I want the width, let's say, to be 1. All right, and I want this for both. Let's just see what happens here. When I click save and update it on the chart, these labels will go away and we'll have these trend lines that show up. Let's see what this looks like. Oh, I have an error somewhere. Let's see. Oh, I'm not using PV here. So that's right. PVH here needs to be changed for PV, because it'll be whatever pivot I pass to it. All right. So we're seeing here that trend lines are being drawn, and we can see that it is, since we're not doing any checks at all for it, it's just showing the last 500 lines that it found, and it's tying these pivot points to levels that it finds. And it's drawing it, making sure that the only ones we're seeing here right now is where the pivot highs have not been crossed above and the pivot lows have not been crossed below. Right? So all the internal ones have been gone. So if we were to replay this, let's see if it's not too memory intensive, it'll go through. We'll go see that the trends are being drawn every time the pivot is being created. Okay. All right, so let's keep going. As you guys probably saw, we are repeating something over here. So let's just go ahead and create a function for this. We'll call it a drawTrend. We'll pass it the trend array. So the first trend is the name of the user-defined type that we created. We put in literal brackets because it is an array. So we'll tell it that it is an array. Well, we have to it's an array. And then we're going to decide if it's high or low. And then in here is where we'll have our loop through. All right, and then trend here will be replaced with this guy. All right, so this we don't need. We'll go ahead and do add trend. Right now we're not doing anything with the Boolean H. So let's go ahead and just for the sake of, let's change the color. So we'll say color orange, color blue. Can I find another method? Add trend. Oh, wrong one. drawTrend. So now those are being drawn. Now we do have an issue here where we are, even though it's drawn the lines, it's drawn lines on top of lines on top of lines on top of lines, because every time it draws, it's drawn at the last bar over here. But if I were to move forward, so here on the last bar, this is firing, so it draws it. But now every time I move forward, you see how the lines are getting brighter and brighter and brighter? It's because the lines are being drawn on top of each other again and again and again and again and again. So we don't want that. What we're going to want is to make sure that we do our cleanup. Now, normally you can just do something like this, where you say, like we did before, we're going to loop through all the lines, and we are going to delete it, right? So this would work. The reason I don't normally do this is that if ever I wanted to just draw a label or a line anywhere on the chart, it'll always get deleted. So let's say I wanted to draw a label over here, whatever. Let's go with if I just wanted to do a label, X, Y. That label won't show up because, well, it won't show up because it'll get deleted every time. So what I normally do is that I'll create an array specifically for my drawings. so that I can deal with them later. So here I'm going to create an array for my line. And then this line array, I'm going to go ahead and push this line inside of it. So it doesn't stop the line from being created. It just adds it to this array. And then over here, that array is what I delete afterwards. And that way, it's cleaning up only the lines I wanted to delete afterwards that I'm drawing at the end. But if ever I put any other labels on the chart, it will show up. All right, here the labels are showing up because I'm doing lines and not labels, but you get the idea here. All right. Here you can also see the idea here of the time it's taken to go through it. Why it matters to limit the array size, because over here, if we have it's looping through every pivot here, right? So there's 100 pivots in here, times 100 that are in here that is checking again. And so if we do 100 times 100, 100 times 100, we're dealing with 10,000 iterations. And so if we weren't limiting the size of the array, let's say we had something here for 5,000, it would take, after it compiles, let's see how long it takes to load. And it'll take a while to load. In fact, if it's too long, it'll even time out the script to say that it's taking too long. So that's one of the reasons why we limit the size of the array. Yeah, still not loading. All right, but if I save this and it compiles, then it'll load again, and it'll just take a second for it to show up. Okay, so now we have our trend lines. What do we want to do? Okay, so we want to be able to update the trend. We want to be able to, on every bar, we want to check to see for the trends that we have saved, if we should be clearing it or not. So we're going to go ahead here and create a new function. And we're going to call this updateTrend. Here we're going to pass the trend array. And in here, we're gonna determine, we're only gonna check this when the bar state is confirmed. We don't want to do this on every single tick update of the bar. And so we want to take a look at. Let me just see here. Oh, yeah, we're missing something for the if statement. So what we're going to be doing here is we're looping through all the trends. So you would have something here for index of the trend and ATRN. And ATRN will be whatever the trend array that we pass, either the high or the low. And we're going to say we want to be able to get the distance from if let's say we're dealing with the highs. We're going to have a high variable right now. We're going to have a high value on the candle that we're on right now, whether it's a pivot or not, just the high of the candle we're on right now. We want to know how far that that point is from our trend, because we're going to want to find out if that point is near on. Is that if it's like the size for a trend high, we want to go ahead and clear that that trend. We want to remove it. But we also want to keep track of every time a point comes close to that trend, because what we'll do is that every time a point gets close or on that trend, we're going to basically count the number of times that happens, because that'll allow us to be able to tell, gather information about the strength of that trend, when it might break and that sort of thing. We're not going to do. You can actually count every time that happens. So we need to know if that value is, what's the distance of that value from the actual trend line. And so we're going to need, we have a variable called dist, and we're going to use a function that we're going to create right now called distTrend. And we'll pass it, since we'll have this trend, we'll pass it the XY and the, actually you don't even do this. We just pass the trend value. and we also need the chart point of now, right? We need to know what the now period is, what the now candle is. So we'll go ahead and do now is equal to chart point. And we're going to pass it the current time to turn current bar index. Actually, we don't need to do that. We could just do now, like we saw before, and we just need to pass the price. And so that price, if we're dealing with a high, will be the high, and if we're dealing with a low, it'll be the low. And then we'll pass that in here. So let's go ahead and create a function called distance from trend. It'll be a method for which we pass our trend. And all right, and here what we're going to do is, so there's this formula is there in order to do this. We're going to calculate the slope of the line, and then we're going to calculate the y coordinate on the line on that x at that value. So what we're going to do here is just a simple formula in order to figure out if we have the slope of the line, where the third point is, where the now point is in relationship to that line. So we'll do it this way. We'll calculate the slope, which will be the trend xy1. It'll be the price of that minus the actually 2 minus the first one, and we'll divide that by xy2, the index minus the index. This is just a formula of calculating a slope. Xy price, index, index. Then we'll calculate the intercept. Then we calculate the y coordinate. So that'll be m times xy3 index plus b. And then we want to calculate the vertical distance, which will be xy3 price minus y line. So this will return, this will be the distance of the x3 coordinate from the line. We have something wrong here. Let me just see. All right, distance trend. So this variable will have our distance. We can check that. Well, we don't have to check that right now. We'll see that in a second. Now that distance, what we want is we want to make sure, we want to check to see if that distance is within a certain buffer for the trend line, right? Because we want to check to see if the price is near that trend line, but only to a certain extent. So let's go ahead and draw, we're going to add an input over here for the user to be able to put a buffer. So we'll say trend buffer. We'll do that at 250 ticks. All right. And then that buffer will set it up here. We'll say the buffer is equal to the number of ticks times this. So we have that buffer variable. So now we're going to say if this distance that we just calculated is above 0, so here we're dealing with a high, and the distance is below the buffer, or the distance is below 0 and the distance is above the buffer, right? So this distance, we already have the point, so this distance is the distance between that point and the line. And so if we're within the buffer distance, it means that we're near the line. we're going to go ahead and in the trend, we want to count this. So let's go ahead and add a field to our trend, and this one we'll call chart point count. So this is we'll use this to store all the points that touch this trend. And we'll go ahead and push that in. So that way the array will let us know if the trend has been touched, and also we'll be able to access all the different points in there if we needed to. Let's say if we wanted to draw points on the chart for every single time it happened. So in trend, we want to go ahead. Before we do that, we should the two first points that we want inside of that count array is the previous and current points that we saw before. So let's go ahead here and just add in trim count, and we're going to make this an array from the previous value and the current value. That way, now this will be an array from those guys. Forgot to set this up as a literal array because it needs to be an array of chart points. And then over here for trend count push, now we're adding in the current value into that the counting array. All right. After that, let's go ahead and determine if we're going to break this trend, if this trend is broken or not. So if we're going to say, we're going to add a field called delete, right? So this will be a deletion, and it'll by default be set to false. And so if the delete field is, we want to go ahead and we want to check the position of this trend like we did before of XY1, XY2, and now. So this is our variable before where we pass the 2 points of the trend plus the point we're checking, which is the point now, which we already had before over here. And we want to check to see if we're in high, we want to check if it's a 1. Otherwise, we want to check if it's -1. If it is, then the trend is broken. So we want to set the trend to delete, to true. Perfect. Now, the reason we're doing this to set this to true is because when we are in our draw trend over here, we don't want to draw a trend if not trend delete, right? We don't want to draw the trends that have been deleted. Problem over here. Let's see what this looks like. All right, let's take a look. Let's go to daily. All right, so far so good. Let's see when a trend gets broken. Oh, we are timing out. We have an error here. Memory limit exceeded. Study allocates 1.3 times more than allowed. Yeah, we're doing too much. We're drawing too much on the chart. All right, so we'll fix that in a bit. But for the moment, we know that that's working. All right, so we're missing one thing over here. We're not actually calling on update trend. So let's go ahead and we'll say here, if trend H, we're going to update trend, true, and low for false. All right, so now it's cleared up a bunch of those lines. So now this is what we're expecting to see, that all the trends that were broken are gone, and what's only left are the trends that are not. Let's head back down to the 1 hour, see what that looks like. And so we have these trend lines. Let's see how that replays. There we go. Let's draw in the trend lines. And when it gets broken, the trend lines disappear. There, it broke. When it creates another one, boom, trend line appears. It broke and it came back again. Okay. Let's take a look at this. Alrighty. Okay, so good start. I do want to see the points here, though, for the pivots. So let's just go ahead and add that in. So when I'm drawing my trends, I'm going to want to have not only the line here, but I'm going to want, let's draw the buffer around the trend. So let's actually move this guy. We'll switch these guys back to chart foreground color. And then I want to draw a buffer. So I need a buffer top. And then a buffer bottom. And this will be the same coordinates as my first one. But I have to use time because I want to adjust I'm going to adjust the lines, the Y value, so that they're a little bit above, a little bit below. So I'm drawing it this way, X1 price, X2 time, trend price. I want this to be using bar time. I want it extended none. And actually, we don't care about the color for this one. We only want these buffer top and bottom in order to draw the range because we use a line fill instead. Let's see what that looks like. So this will be, I guess it doesn't matter what style it is. Let's call it solid. Is there a width? So I'm doing this way. I'm going to want the top line to be plus the buffer, minus the buffer. So these two lines are above and below our main trend line. And then I want to draw a line fill. Is it line fill? And it'll be the buffer top. And the color will be, let's call it, if in H we want it to be color orange. Otherwise color blue. And we want that to be pretty transparent. That'll be our line fill. What we want over here is, we don't really care about storing these lines inside of an array to delete them because they'll get overwritten by the other lines that are being drawn. We do want this line fill though to carry along. So let's go ahead and create a storage variable for our line fills. And then this will be added to that array. And then we have to remember to delete it when it's time to delete it. And that way we delete it. Actually, we have to clear these arrays because even though we deleted them, we don't want the arrays to stay full because then it'll get too big, right? Because we're deleting the drawing within the array, but that array position is still there. And so the array still thinks it's very big. And so when it loops through through the entire array every single time, it'll get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So we want to go ahead and clear the array. And while we're at it, we could just toss this into a function that's delete, just to keep consistent. We do this, what do we see? We white buffer around them. There we go. So here's a buffer around them, and let's go ahead and actually draw the pivot points, just so we can see them. So that's for that. All right, what we want to go ahead here is we're going to loop through, and remember we have all the points, the first and last points of the trend, as well as all the points that have been touched on the trend within this count array. So we'll go ahead and access that count array. So in drawTrend count, and we are going to go ahead and create a new label. We'll use the time and price. Actually, we don't even need to use that. CNT will have the time and price. So that's the point. The text will be, let's go with, I like drawing my own because the labels for some reason are ginormous when it comes to labels nowadays. I don't know what kind of change happened there. We're going to use xlog time. We're going to set those dots at the price. We're going to use color NA will make this a transparent color while still taking up a spot. If we just do NA, the label width to it, we'll do a center label. The color will be orange if it's high, blue if it's low. Actually, since we repeated that, let's just go ahead and put that in a variable at the top. At 2 occasions we see that. See? And then it'll be tiny. And let's go with large. Let's add that into a field called label, which we'll create. This is for our cleanup, remember? We have that up here. And we'll add label up here. Let's see what that looks like when we save it. Did we limit the size of that, of the number of dots in there? Let's take a look at count. So we did that when it was touching. Here, no, we didn't limit the size. Oh, we don't need to limit the size. The size is what it is. The number of times it hit it's the number of times it hit it. So here we take a look at the chart. We can see, yep, we're getting the spots, the marks for where the pivots are. I do like having that in there, but let's mark the initial pivots differently. So let's go ahead and so we know that the first 2 points inside of that counter array are the ones we added initially, the previous and current, so the 2 points of the actual trend. So what we'll say here is that if the index is less than or equal to 1, so that'll be index 0 and index 1, the 2 first ones. Let's go ahead and make that, let's go make that a diamond. Let's do this. And then also we'll change the size of it. So if equal to 1, let's go ahead and make this size large. Turn you 2. Let's see what that looks like. Good, much better. So now we have the, so for example, on this, these trends, all right, it's picking up the trend because even though it doesn't care if we're only drawing the line over here, all these dots are showing because those are trend, which is very useful to see when we're clustering. Maybe we'll extend these lines, make it a little bit more useful for us. So that's pretty cool. Let's take a look as we go along. Let's do a replay. So here we're seeing these lines. If it were extended, we'd have these dots over here. I'm not sure if you're seeing it. There's these blue dots showing up. And so we can see every time it touches those levels. It'll be useful for us to have an extension there. So let's go ahead and add an extend. What we want is an extend option. So let's go ahead and, you know what, while we're at it, let's do a few things here. So we want to be able to set if we're actually using that delete function, because maybe we don't want the trends to be deleted for some reason if we wanted to see them. So move broken trends, group trends, and this we'll use down here. So if we use delete, So we're going to say here that if this option is being used and it's not deleted, do it. Or if the option is not being used, ignore the delete option altogether. Then we're going to do, so here if we save this, and we take a look at the chart, we're seeing our chart like normal. Let's get out of replay. Let's go back to daily. See that chart like normal, but if I wanted to remove that delete option, I should see a ton of other trends. Yeah, perfect. So we can toggle that on and off. So this is just a quick tutorial of how to go ahead and create simple trend lines on the chart. There's much more we can do with this, and I've gone ahead and created an indicator for you. And if you go into this one that you'll see published on TradingView and on our blog, you'll be able to see a lot more options that we've added to it. So you can set the different time frame for the chart. You can set the pivot highs and pivot low, the sources for them. You can track to see when the line should break, when they should not. Should you show past ones? How to deal with log scales? All kinds of different things. And within the code for that one will be a walkthrough, a detailed walkthrough of all the different things that we've done so far and the reason why those things are set up the way that they are. So I encourage you very much to go ahead and take a look at the script, try it out for yourself. Like I said, the goal of this is not to show you the best way of doing trend lines. There's obviously better ways or different ways you can go about it, but you might find this to be a particularly good jumping off point. And we'd love to see you guys make variations with the script, use it inside of your own code, and make something. Oh, one additional thing is that the tutorial script that's inside a library in such a way that it'll Confluence indicator. So if you use the Confluence indicator, it's possible we set up the script so that there are that are for when you for when this new trend and for when trend lines break, and that way inside of the Confluence of alerts, you can go ahead and choose those guys as an option. So that you can create different types of more complex strategies surrounding it. And in the code of that script will be a step-by-step guide as to how that's done and why it's done that way. All right, if you have any questions, you'll always find us on our Discord, or you can message us in support. These tools are really just here in order to, show you something that might be cool. It might be interesting for some of you in order to learn how to code in PineScript, or to be able to show something to a developer that you want to hire if you want them to be able to code something. So you can always go into the Discord group in order to talk with other people to see if they have any questions or any feedback or anything like that. And obviously, if we get a chance, we'd love to be able to get feedback on the script. If there's any way of making it better, we're happy to do so. But like with everything, it requires your feedback. So that's it for me. My name is Tom Hartman, and I'll see you in the next video.